Hey everybody, Tim Parrish here for the Huntington Church of Christ. Welcome to Wednesday in the Word. This evening I want us to spend a few minutes talking about the third king of Israel, a guy named Solomon. Solomon sometimes is referred to as the wisest man who ever lived, and there's no question he sometimes showcased his wisdom. But I think it's also fair to say that Solomon, by the end of his life, shows that wisdom isn't always a guarantee that wisdom itself will be followed. Sometimes foolish choices come despite divine wisdom. Sometimes Solomon is also referred to as one of the wealthiest men who ever lived, and I do want to explore his wealth just a little bit with you. And just as it is today, sometimes wealth inspires the imagination of those who are looking at it. And we'll talk a little bit about how that played itself out in some rabbinical tradition. But it's important for us to understand who Solomon is and how he came to be the king. Now you may remember that we find Solomon as the third king. Well, you don't have to go back very many years until there was no king. And the people began to ask for one. Saul, you remember, is anointed as the first king of Israel. And there were parts of Saul's reign that were good, but Saul kind of went crazy and was inhabited by a spirit that was not the spirit of the Lord. He became murderous toward David. Ultimately, David is anointed to be the next king. David, somewhat an unlikely choice compared to Saul. He's the youngest child in a family and not the one that anybody in his own family would have picked as the next king. And yet he is anointed. He kind of stays in the shadows a little bit until Saul ultimately dies and David takes his place as the rightful king. David reigns for a number of years. David has a number of sons, and eventually, as we know the progression of things will go, David will no longer be the king, and his son Solomon will assume the throne. But it's not like this is just one smooth, unbroken story. In fact, Solomon, in his own family, in some ways might be the least likely choice to serve as the next king beyond his father David. It's also interesting to note that at the particular time in which we find Solomon serving, he will be the last king over a united kingdom. After Solomon's death, the kingdom will divide into those northern and southern kingdoms that we know of as Israel and Judah. And while we will continue to see a genealogical line that will follow from Solomon, it is a little bit of a sad thing, a thing that he knew was coming, that this glorious kingdom would not stay together. Now Solomon comes to the throne at a good time. David, his father, has been a warrior king and has, because of those things, secured a peace for the people of God. And a lot of scholars will say that Solomon came to the throne during the golden age of Israel. He didn't have to go to war. He didn't have to deal with a bad economy. He didn't have to deal with a lot of outside influence. And so there's some really interesting things politically, maybe geopolitically, that kind of play into his time as the king of Israel. But I'm a little bit more interested in some of the personal details. For instance, David had several other sons. Among them we know he had Absalom, he had Amnon, he had Adonijah, and we know Solomon comes along later. Well, Absalom can't be the king because by this time he's dead. Amnon can't be the king because by this time he also is dead. In fact, his brother Absalom killed him. And Adonijah, well, he tries to be the king, and we'll mention that in a moment. But ultimately we come to the youngest child in the family, at that time the youngest son in the family, and he's not from what we might call a great relationship. You see, you may remember, or maybe you don't, that Solomon's parents are David, obviously, and Bathsheba. Now, you may remember the story of David and Bathsheba and how he brought her to himself and how he ends up murdering her husband or having her husband murdered to cover up the fact that she's bearing his child. And that child dies as a result of their sin. And so she later has another son, this one, his name's Solomon. And Solomon is promised from a young age, Solomon's mother is promised from a young age that he in fact will be the next king, not any of David's other sons who might have had a right to the throne. From a young age, we don't know a lot about Solomon. In fact, we really don't meet him until he's becoming the king. And at that time, he's becoming the king during a little bit of political unrest. You see, the book of 1 Kings opens with this rather unusual story about David and his inability to stay warm. Well, some scholars seem to think that that incident with David and Abishag points to David's virility and the fact that as a king you could not continue to remain on the throne if physically you were no longer able to father a son, to father a child. Well, maybe that's what's going on here, because it's in this moment where Adonijah, David's older son, decides he's going to be the king. He's going to take the throne. Now, it's not terribly unusual during all these years of history that someone would challenge for the throne. But the way this all goes down, it's like Adonijah wants it to look official, this coronation, this blessing, this anointing, and yet he doesn't invite a lot of key players, including his father, the king. It's also very odd that a king who is still living would then anoint his son to be the king and step away from the throne. And yet, if what I mentioned to you a moment ago about David might be a factor in all this, it certainly becomes part of the picture that David is considered no longer fit physically to be the king. Well, word gets back from Nathan the prophet to Bathsheba that Adonijah is attempting a takeover. And she goes to David, who despite his age and physical condition, wakes up enough to say, this is not how it's supposed to be. You're right. Solomon, your son, Bathsheba, is supposed to be the next king. And so they have an official coronation ceremony. There is the official anointing, said to be with the oil that Moses had made in the wilderness. And so Solomon becomes not only the king heir, the heir apparent to the throne, but it seems at that moment he actually assumes, before his father's death, the role of king, which is a little unusual to say the least. Well, Adonijah probably is a little bit worried, and Solomon sends word to him, and they meet and they make peace, and Solomon could have executed him for attempting this, but he didn't. He said, I don't have any need to do this. They are half-brothers, and so he allows him to continue on until there is a little bit more subtle attempt by Adonijah to declare himself the king by taking Abishag for himself as a wife. And even though nothing was officially accomplished, if you will, between David and Abishag, she would have been considered a concubine of the king. So if Adonijah takes the king's concubine for himself, it is a political conquering move so that it would in some sense declare him the new king. And so at this point, Solomon has him executed. He has Joab executed. It's a sad moment in history when these kinds of things happen. It's not the first time you have this kind of family trouble over the throne. It won't be the last time you have family trouble over the throne. In fact, to the present, in those nations where there is monarchy or where there is a government that is less democratic than ours, you still see family problems and executions taking place as the power struggle over the throne continues. Well, now Solomon is able to serve as king, and as we continue reading through 1 Kings, we find that God comes to him and in essence says, as king, ask for anything you want, and I'll give it to you. Whatever it is, I'll give you whatever you want. And Solomon says, if you'll allow me to paraphrase, being a king's really hard. And knowing how to manage this nation of people, even in a time of peace and prosperity, it's really, really difficult. And so I would like for you to grant me wisdom, discernment, so that I can be the kind of king that you want me to be. Well, this pleases the Lord, and the Lord tells him, you will receive that. But that's not all you're going to receive. You will also receive financial blessing. You'll receive material blessing because you didn't ask for it. I'm going to give it to you anyway. So Solomon begins to amass wealth. But there's a story that comes, and I got to tell you, as a kid, this is one of those Sunday school stories that didn't seem very much like a Sunday school story, because one of the first cases that's brought to the king to hear this legal case, one of the jobs of the king in those days, was brought by a mom. A mom who says, my neighbor here, she stole my baby. We both had babies about the same time, about the same age, and her baby died. And she has stolen my baby. And I need you as the king to intervene and give it back. Well, Solomon does this really bizarre sounding thing. And he says, y'all wait right here. Somebody get me a sword. And so a sword is brought to Solomon. And he proposes that the baby be divided in half physically. That he use the sword to cleave that baby into two pieces and give one to each mother. And that ought to satisfy them. Now, from the outside, just reading that, it seems like, wow, what a strange story. Except Solomon, in his wisdom, was testing these two mamas. And the mom of the baby who had already died, the one who had stolen her neighbor's healthy baby, said, sure, that's fine with me. Cut it in half. As cold as that sounds, it seems that what was going on here is the woman saying, if I don't have my baby, it's fine that you don't have your baby either. Except the mom of the living baby says, no way. Don't cut the baby in two. Just let her have it. Solomon understood that the woman who said, don't do this, is the woman whose baby was very much alive, and she didn't want to watch her baby be killed. Now, that's one of those stories that's disturbing on 100 different levels, and yet it's written there in the early pages of 1 Kings as a testimony to the discerning wisdom of Solomon. Well, as time goes on and things come and go in Solomon's life, one of the things that does begin to happen is he does begin to amass great amounts of wealth. In fact, some modern estimates, looking back at what is known about Solomon and his wealth at that time, have estimated that if you put today's dollar value on Solomon's financial standing, that he would have a net worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $2.2 trillion, as in 1,000 billion. And a billion is 1,000 million. $2 trillion. Now, it's a little bit unfair to say it's Solomon's net worth because it's really the net worth of the kingdom. But in those days, because of the nature of the monarchy, it's Solomon's net worth. And one of the things that he did during his reign, which lasted almost 40 years, was collect taxes and duties from the nations around him as a part of their peace accords, peace treaties. And it is estimated that he collected over $2 million worth of gold in these things. A tremendous amount of money, or $2 billion worth rather. $2.4 billion worth of gold just from that alone. And you may remember reading that his wealth and his wisdom were told everywhere. The stories went out from there, so that the Queen of Sheba comes to see and to ask questions, to interview him, to test him, to gaze upon his wealth. And she apparently was incredibly impressed. We should be equally impressed because this is probably a 1,200-mile journey for her to come and see what Solomon was all about. But she made the journey and actually brought him more stuff, made presents as she came. And so Solomon is accumulating all these things. And one of the things that rabbinic tradition has preserved is this legend, if you will, of Solomon's throne. That Solomon had this massive throne that was made out of ivory, and that it was overlaid with gold. And I don't know if you've ever seen any artist renditions. I saw some that just, well, I didn't necessarily find them worth giving to you. I've seen some in the past in some books and some films, but I couldn't find one that I really wanted to share with you on this video. But it's not just that it's a big throne. This thing is massive, and it came to have all these mystical properties associated with it. I want to read to you from an article that I was looking at today about Solomon's throne, because I just found this fascinating, and you may too. Again, sometimes looking at wealth from the outside stokes the imagination, and you begin to think all these things that get larger and larger as you think and tell the story. King Solomon's throne was the most wonderful throne any king ever sat on. Fashioned of ivory and covered with gold, it was set with rubies, sapphires, emeralds, and other precious stones that shone with the most brilliant, the most dazzling, the most fascinating hues and colors. 6 steps led to the seat, and each step served to remind the king of one of the 6 special commandments that the kings of Israel were commanded to observe. On the first step, a golden lion lay, facing a golden ox on the opposite side. On the second step, a golden wolf faced a golden lamb. On the third step, a golden tiger faced a golden camel. The fourth, a golden eagle faced a golden peacock. On the fifth, a golden cat faced a golden rooster. And on the sixth, a golden hawk faced a golden dove. Higher still above the throne, a golden dove held a golden hawk in its beak. On the side, rising over the throne, stood an exquisite menorah. That's the candelabra, you may remember, of pure gold, decorated with golden cups, knobs, flowers, blossoms, and petals. On each side of the menorah, 7 branches turned upward. On the branches of one side were engraved names of 7 fathers of the world, from Adam to Jacob, with Job in the center. On the other 7, the names of those pious men who ever lived. And there's a number of them. On each side of the throne was a special golden chair, one for the high priest, one for the assistant high priest, surrounded by 70 golden chairs for the 70 elders of the Sanhedrin. 24 golden vines formed a huge canopy above the throne. Now, can you see this in your mind? This huge, elaborate gold overlaid thing with all these extra chairs that were somehow kind of made a part of it? You haven't heard anything yet. As the rabbis have preserved some of this in their ancient commentary, listen to the almost magical things that this throne was said to do. When Solomon stepped on the throne, a mechanism was set in motion. As soon as he stepped on the first step, the golden ox and the golden lion each stretched out 1 foot to support him and help him rise to the next step. On each side, the animals assisted the king until he was comfortably seated on the throne. No sooner was he seated than a golden eagle brought the great crown and held it just above King Solomon's brow, so that it would not weigh heavily on his head. Thereupon the golden dove flew over the holy ark and brought out a tiny scroll of the Torah and placed it in King Solomon's lap, in accordance with the commandment of the Torah that the Torah should always be with the king to guide him in his reign over the people. Then the high priest, the assistant, and all the 70 elders would rise to greet the king and sit to hear cases brought forth from judgment. Now, this goes on to all the different kings who stole Solomon's throne and took it to their temples, and the struggles and the problems that they had related to it, and the things that these animals would do to them instead of helping them. And why do I share that with you? You don't find that in the Word, and that's what our focus has usually been on each Wednesday night, is looking into the Word. Well, sometimes looking just outside the Word helps us to understand how these characters were viewed even not so many years after their life had ended. Well, Solomon is no doubt a tremendously wealthy individual with a tremendously valuable kingdom. And I'm sure there is some measure of truth to the ornate nature of his throne. But one of Solomon's greatest achievements is something that his father David had wanted for so very long. David had a great desire to build God a permanent house. You see, up to that time, God lived, in essence, in a tent, the tabernacle. Oh, God didn't dwell there. God didn't live there, but God's presence did come there. God is not really contained by any building or by any tent, but it was a very significant place. And one of the things David wanted the most was to build something more permanent, something more appropriate for Yahweh. And so one of the things that God promised him is, he told David he couldn't build it. He was a man of too much blood. Well, Solomon comes to the throne during a time of peace and never goes to war. And so he becomes the one, and God promised to David that his son would build the throne. Well, David set about gathering all the materials for the temple, so that when it came time for Solomon to build the temple, no piece of the temple construction was cut on site. And the idea was that no weapon of war, or nothing that could be used as a weapon of war, should be present on the Temple Mount and should be a part of this construction. Now, we think sometimes of Solomon's temple as one of the ancient wonders of the world, with its gold overlay and its ornate furnishings. One of the things that may surprise you, though, is that Solomon's temple, as he built it, would actually fit inside a standard basketball court. There would be room on each end and room on each side. Now, it stood about 3 stories tall, so maybe it might not fit in every gymnasium, but in most high school basketball gyms, you could put Solomon's temple at center court, and there would be room for the players to sit on either side. There would be room to walk around on either end, and it wouldn't touch either goal on either end. Now, I don't know if that's surprising to you, but when I sat down and really figured out some of those numbers and looked at what some of the measurements were that had been given to us by Bible scholars and by the biblical text, it's pretty crazy when you think about the temple, because it seems like it should be so much larger than that. But don't let the size being smaller than it might have seemed diminish the splendor of this thing. It was absolutely magnificent. And so if there is a gift that Solomon leaves to the world, maybe that would be it. Now, because we are readers of the Bible, and because on Wednesday evenings we're opening the book together, it is obviously important to note that Solomon makes a contribution to the written text of the Bible as well. Solomon, we think, is responsible for writing many of, maybe even most of what's contained in the book of Proverbs, those daily sayings of wisdom, many of which are just as applicable today when you come across them. It's as if they're written for the present time. We think Solomon also is the author, the physical author of that book, the Song of Solomon. And there's some suggestion that maybe Solomon wrote that as a love story of him and his first wife. But my favorite contribution from Solomon is the book of Ecclesiastes. It's not a terribly positive book. In fact, if you flip through Ecclesiastes, if you read through it, if you're familiar with the book, you know that in essence, as an old man looking back across his life, a life which would at one point include 700 wives and an additional 300 concubines. Solomon would look at all his accomplishments. He would look at even his wealth. He would look at it and he would say, it's worthless. All that stuff I thought would give my life meaning, it didn't. I don't have the meaningful life I thought I would have based on those kinds of measurements. And he talks in the book about the quest for possessions and the quest for things. And as happens in the book of Proverbs, he points a lot to the pursuit of wisdom. He talks about, in that one famous text, the idea of there being a time for everything, that there's a time for every purpose under heaven. But he comes to the end of that book, Ecclesiastes chapter 12. And he begins in verse 1, and I know these are familiar verses to you, but this is really where I want you to take, we could talk about Solomon's foolishness. He did turn to idolatry, and unfortunately, he would lead the nation into idolatry, part of what happens with the division of the kingdom, which didn't happen until after his death because of God's promise to David. And Solomon died, and then the kingdom just splits apart and sets in motion a terrible chain of events, which is littered with idolatry. And that comes into Solomon's life because of all the foreign marriages that he had, many of them probably political in nature. But those wives and those concubines influenced his heart away from the worship of the one true God. And that leads to the division of the kingdom. But as he's watching all this, as he's thinking about all this, probably with that in the back of his mind, Ecclesiastes chapter 12 begins with verse 1. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near, when you will say, I have no delight in them. Before the sun and the light, the moon and the stars are darkened, and the clouds return after the rain. In the day that the watchmen of the house tremble, and the mighty men stoop, and the grinding ones stand idle because they're few, and those who look through the windows grow dim, and the doors in the street are shut as the sound of the grinding mill is low. And one will arise at the sound of the bird, and all the daughters of the song will sing softly. Furthermore, men are afraid of high places and terrors on the road. The almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags himself along, the caperberry is ineffective. For a man goes to his eternal home, while mourners go about in the street. Remember him before the silver cord is broken, and the golden bowl is crushed. The pitcher by the well is shattered, the wheel at the cistern is crushed. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. In other words, all the stuff that the world will tell you, if you have this, if you do this, if you become this, you will be happy and your life will have meaning. He says, I had it all, and I'm telling you, at the end of the day, we all get old, and our bodies break down and wear out, and then we die. Nobody is getting out of here alive. So stop filling your life with stuff that's going to go the same way you're going. You have a limited amount of time here on the earth, Solomon says. So what do you need to do? Remember your Creator. Keep your mind on God and the things of God. Remember your Creator. And don't wait. He says, don't waste your life and one day wake up as an old man and realize, man, I really had my focus on all these fleeting things that are worthless now. And then he comes back and says this. In addition to being a wise man, the preacher taught the people knowledge. He pondered, he searched, and he arranged the proverbs. He sought to find delightful words to write the words of truth correctly. And the words of wise men are like goads, and masters of these collections like well-driven nails given by one shepherd. But beyond this, my son, be warned, the writing of many books is endless. Excessive devotion to books is wearying to the body. So what's the conclusion? What then? Out of all of this that he considered in his life, out of the depths of his wisdom, how is this letter ended? Well, the conclusion when all has been heard is this. Fear God. Keep His commandments. Because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or whether it is evil. Solomon from the Word would say, listen, take it from a guy who had all the money he could want. Take it from a guy who had all the sources of pleasure that anybody could ever dream of. Take it from a guy who had fame along with fortune. Listen to me. What really matters, in fact, the only thing that matters, is fear God and keep His commandments. Remember your Creator and live the life that He says for you to live. Because the rest of that, well, we're dying. And we can't take it with us. And when this life is over, who cares how much money you had? It didn't keep you from dying. Who cares how much fame you had? You still went to the grave. Who cares about all the pleasurable things that you enjoyed and experienced in life? It didn't keep you alive. Now, you and I know, because we're looking back from this side of the cross, that following the advice of Solomon to fear God and keep His commandments is the actual thing that will lead us to life and that will give us the confidence that those who believe in Jesus, even though we die, will never really die. We get to live. I think had Solomon known Jesus in the way that we have the opportunity to know Jesus, that might be how he would have finished this writing of Ecclesiastes. Oh, there's more stuff we could talk about with Solomon. There's obviously a lot of his details of his life, like the wives and like the idolatry that we didn't speak about. But Solomon's greatest gift to the present is not that he built this magnificent temple or he had a fancy throne. Solomon's greatest contribution to us today is a reminder to not get caught up in the junk, in the stuff that we think matters, and to spend our lives fearing God and keeping His commandments and being whole, having shalom. Thanks for stopping by.